The rain came down like judgment that night, turning the red clay road into a river of mud and regret. Amina stood at the iron gate of what used to be her home, her hands gripping the cold metal bars, as if holding on could somehow change what was happening. She was 17 years old, soaked to the bone, and everything she owned lay scattered in the dirt behind her: torn clothes, water-damaged books, and a single photograph of her mother that she clutched against her chest like a lifeline. From the balcony above, her stepmother Beatrice appeared, a dark silhouette framed by the golden light of the house. Her voice cut through the storm like a blade, sharp and merciless, screaming words that would echo in Amina's mind for years to come. She called her worthless, called her a burden, called her nothing but shame wrapped in skin. Behind Beatrice, Amina could see her stepsisters watching from the window. Kioma's face blank and unreadable, Ngozi looking away as if ashamed. But neither of them moved to help. Neither of them said a word. That silence hurt more than any insult ever could. Amina didn't understand how her life had come to this moment, standing in the rain outside a locked gate, rejected by the only family she had left in the world. Her mind raced back through the years, trying to find the exact moment when everything went wrong, when the woman who promised to care for her transformed into the monster who now wanted her gone. She remembered her mother, Folasad, the finest seamstress in their village, a woman whose hands could create magic from fabric and thread. Folasade had raised Amina alone, in a small house on a piece of land that had been in their family for generations, and though they didn't have much, they had each other, and that had been enough. Amina's father had never been part of the picture. Her mother rarely spoke of him, and when she did, it was only to say that he'd had to leave before Amina was born, that circumstances had torn them apart, that he'd loved her even though he couldn't stay. Those words had never made much sense to a child, but Amina had accepted them because her mother's love had been sufficient to fill any void. But then Folasad got sick, and everything changed in ways that Amina, at 12 years old, couldn't possibly have been prepared for. It started with headaches that her mother dismissed as stress from too much work. Then came the dizziness, the moments when Folasad would steady herself against the doorframe, her face going pale and distant. One morning in the market, surrounded by customers and colorful fabric, Folasad simply collapsed, her body crumpling like one of her unfinished dresses. The village doctor said it was something in her brain, something that couldn't be fixed with the resources they had, something that required specialists and hospitals and money that they didn't possess. For 3 months, Amina watched her mother fade, watched the strongest woman she knew become fragile and thin, watched the light in her eyes dim a little more each day. The night before she died, Folasad pulled Amina close with trembling hands and whispered words that seemed urgent and desperate, words about finding Amina's father's family, about how they owed her everything, about a man named Dominic who lived in Lagos. But before Amina could ask more, before she could understand what her mother meant, Folasada's eyes closed, and she never opened them again. After the funeral, Amina's uncle appeared, her mother's younger brother, who lived 2 villages away and whom she barely knew. He cried at the grave, made promises about taking care of his niece, about honoring his sister's memory, about making sure Amina would never be alone. 2 weeks later, he brought Beatrice, introducing her as a distant relative who had graciously agreed to become Amina's guardian. Beatrice was tall and elegant, always dressed in expensive fabrics that seemed out of place in their simple village, and she smiled at Amina with teeth that were too white, too perfect, too cold. She spoke in a voice like honey, making promises about how everything would be fine, how Amina would be taken care of, how she would have sisters now. Beatrice's 2 daughters Kioma and Ngozi, who stood behind their mother with calculating eyes. At first, Amina wanted to believe it, wanted to trust that this woman would fill even a fraction of the hole her mother's death had left. But within weeks, the mask began to slip, and Amina saw the truth beneath the elegant clothes and honeyed words. Beatrice wasn't there to help. She was there to take. The takeover was swift and methodical, executed with a precision that spoke of practice and planning. Beatrice moved into the house and immediately began erasing Folasad's presence as if her mother had never existed at all. She sold the sewing machines that Folasad had used to build her business, claiming they were outdated and useless. She burned her mother's journals, years of designs, patterns, notes, and dreams turned to ash in a metal drum behind the house, while Amina watched in silent horror. She fired the apprentices who had worked for Folasad, sent them away without pay or explanation, and closed the sewing shop that had been the heart of the household. Kioma and Ngozi took over Amina's bedroom, relegating her to a small storage room at the back of the house that smelled of damp and neglect. Beatrice enrolled her daughters in the best secondary school in the district, but pulled Amina out of school entirely, claiming that 3 tuitions were too expensive and that Amina needed to contribute to the household. What that meant, in practice, was that Amina became a servant in her own home, cooking and cleaning and serving Beatrice and her daughters as if she were hired help rather than family. The cruelty started small, almost imperceptible, like a slow poison seeping into every corner of Amina's life. Beatrice would make cutting remarks about Amina's appearance, her intelligence, her worth, always delivered with a smile that made the words cut deeper. She would serve Kioma and Ngozi generous portions at dinner, while giving Amina scraps, explaining that food was expensive and that Amina should be grateful for whatever she received. When Amina tried to protest, tried to assert that this was her mother's house and her mother's land, Beatrice would laugh, a cold, brittle sound that held no humor, and tell her that children had no rights, that she was lucky to have a roof over her head at all. Amina tried to reach out to the people who had known her mother, the neighbors and friends who used to smile at her in the market. But Beatrice had gotten to them first, spinning stories about how difficult Amina was, how ungrateful, how she'd been spoiled by her mother and needed discipline. One by one, the village turned against her, or at least turned away, unwilling to get involved in what they saw as a family matter. Amina learned what it meant to be truly alone, even while surrounded by people. Then, Amina found the documents, and everything suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. She'd been searching for something of her mother's, anything that Beatrice hadn't destroyed or sold, when she discovered a folder hidden in the back of Beatrice's closet. Inside were land deeds, official documents with government stamps, papers that declared Beatrice the legal owner of the house and the land that had belonged to Folasad's family for 3 generations. At the bottom of the deed was a signature, Folasad's signature, or at least something that was supposed to be. But Amina had seen her mother's handwriting 1,000 times, had watched her sign documents and letters, had saved notes that Folasad had written to her. This signature was wrong. The loops were too tight, the slant was off, the pressure of the pen was inconsistent. It was a forgery, and not even a particularly good one, just good enough to fool bureaucrats who didn't care to look too closely. Beatrice had stolen everything: the house, the land, Amina's entire inheritance, with nothing more than a forged signature and the connections to make it legal. When Amina confronted her the next morning, shaking with rage and betrayal, Beatrice barely looked up from her breakfast, her voice calm and dismissive, as she challenged Amina to prove it, knowing full well that a 17-year-old orphan had no power against her. But Amina tried anyway, because giving up would have meant accepting that her mother's memory could be erased, that evil could triumph simply because it was convenient for everyone to look the other way. She went to the village chief first, the same man who used to joke with her mother in the market, who had attended Folasade's funeral and spoken about what a loss her death was to the community. He listened to Amina's story with tired eyes, nodding along as she explained about the forged signature, the stolen land, the systematic destruction of everything her mother had built. When she finished, he sighed deeply, folded his hands on his desk, and told her that Beatrice had done a lot for the village, had donated money to the school, had helped fund repairs to the clinic, had made herself invaluable to the community's welfare. He asked Amina if she really wanted to make an enemy of someone so powerful, if she understood that accusations like this could have consequences, if she'd considered that maybe, just maybe, her memory of her mother's signature wasn't as reliable as she thought. The implication was clear. The truth mattered less than keeping the peace, and Amina's justice mattered less than Beatrice's money. She left his office feeling sick, understanding for the first time how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. Desperate and running out of options, Amina sought help from the village pastor, a man her mother had trusted, a man who had blessed their home and prayed over Folasade's sickbed. Surely, she thought, a man of God would care about truth and justice, would stand up for an orphaned girl being robbed of her inheritance. He listened with kind eyes and gentle nods, let her pour out the whole story of betrayal and theft, and then placed a weathered hand on her shoulder and told her that forgiveness was the path to peace, that bitterness would destroy her soul faster than any earthly injustice, that she needed to submit to authority and trust that God would reward her virtue in time. He spoke of turning the other cheek, of rendering unto Caesar, of suffering in this world being a test of faith. Not once did he suggest actually helping her, actually intervening, actually standing up to Beatrice on her behalf. His advice was to accept her fight, to be grateful for the scraps she received, to wait for justice in heaven, since she certainly wouldn't find it on earth. Amina walked out of that church, feeling more alone than ever, realizing that the institutions she'd been taught to trust, the elders, the authorities, even the church, would not save her, because saving her would be inconvenient and uncomfortable. So Amina decided to save herself, one small act of rebellion at a time, one hidden coin at a time, building toward a future that Beatrice couldn't control. She started taking odd jobs wherever she could find them, washing clothes for neighbors, selling vegetables in the market, braiding hair for women who remembered her mother, and still had some sympathy to spare. Every coin she earned, she saved, hiding the money in the one place she knew Beatrice would never think to look, inside her mother's locket, the gold necklace that Folasade had always worn and that Amina now wore every day. The locket had a hidden compartment that Amina had discovered by accident, a tiny space where her mother used to keep a spare key or a small photo. And now, Amina used it to store her hope, one folded bill at a time. Her plan was simple, but would take time. Save enough money to hire a real lawyer, someone outside the village who didn't owe Beatrice any favors, someone who could help her prove the forgery and reclaim what was rightfully hers. It would take months, maybe years, but Amina was patient, because patience was all she had left. But then Kioma found the money, and everything fell apart faster than Amina could have imagined possible. Amina came home one afternoon to find Beatrice standing in the courtyard, the locket dangling from her fingers and a small stack of bills laid out on the table like evidence in a trial. Kioma stood beside her mother, eyes downcast, but not apologetic, and Ngozi hovered near the door, looking uncomfortable, but silent as always. Beatrice's face was twisted into an expression of theatrical hurt, as if she were the victim here, as if she were the one who had been betrayed. She demanded to know where Amina had gotten this money, why she had hidden it, what she had been planning to do with it. Amina tried to explain that she'd earned it, that it was hers, that she had every right to save money for her future. But Beatrice cut her off with a sharp gesture, declaring that anything Amina earned while living under Beatrice's roof belonged to Beatrice, that attempting to hide money was the same as stealing, that this proved what Beatrice had suspected all along, that Amina was deceitful and ungrateful. Before Amina could protest further, Beatrice announced that there would be a family gathering that evening, that the community needed to know what kind of girl Amina really was. And that's exactly what happened. That evening, Beatrice invited half the village to their home. Neighbors, the chief, the pastor, anyone who mattered in their small community. She served food and drinks, played the gracious host, and then, when everyone was comfortable and attentive, she made her announcement. With trembling voice and tears that appeared on command, she told everyone that Amina had been stealing from the family, that she'd found hidden money, that Amina had taken from the household funds, that despite Beatrice's generosity and kindness, Amina had repaid her with betrayal. She painted a picture of herself as a martyr, a woman who had taken in her dead relative's child out of the goodness of her heart, only to be victimized by that child's ingratitude and criminality. Amina tried to defend herself, tried to explain that the money was earned through her own labor, but her voice was drowned out by Beatrice's performance. The gathered crowd looked at Amina with a mixture of pity and suspicion, seeing a troubled orphan girl who didn't know how good she had it, who couldn't appreciate the woman who had saved her from a life on the streets. No one asked for Amina's side of the story. Not really, because Beatrice's version was more comfortable, more convenient, and didn't require anyone to actually do anything. By the end of the night, Amina's reputation was destroyed, and Beatrice's position was more secure than ever. In the weeks that followed, Amina became a ghost in her own village, invisible to everyone who had once known her name. The women who had hired her for odd jobs suddenly had no work available, always delivered with apologetic smiles that didn't reach their eyes. The market vendors who used to joke with her mother now looked away when Amina passed, as if poverty and injustice might be contagious. Even children in the street whispered about her, calling her a thief, repeating the lies their parents had heard at Beatrice's gathering. Amina spent her days in the small back room that served as her quarters, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. A series of closed doors and turned backs, a slow suffocation of spirit and hope. But then something shifted inside her, some stubborn spark of her mother's strength that refused to be extinguished. She remembered Folasade's last words, the desperate whisper about finding Amina's father, about a man named Dominic in Lagos, about how his family owed her everything. It was the thinnest thread of hope, so thin it might snap if she pulled too hard. But it was all she had, so Amina decided to pull. She studied the locket more carefully than she ever had before, turning it over in her hands, looking for clues her mother might have left behind. And there, on the back of the locket, in tiny engraved letters she'd never noticed, was a message. Diu, Lagos, 1999, the year Amina was born, and the initials of someone her mother had known in Lagos. Diu, could it be her father? Could Dominic's last name start with C? It wasn't much to go on, but it was something, a direction to move in, when she'd been standing still for so long. Before dawn one morning, while Beatrice and her daughters were still sleeping, Amina slipped out of the house and began the long walk to the nearest town that had internet access. It took her 4 hours on foot, her legs aching and her stomach empty, But she finally reached a small cyber cafe where she paid the attendant 50 naira for 30 minutes of computer time. With trembling fingers, she typed into the search engine, Dominic C. Lagos, Nigeria. The results that loaded onto the screen made her breath catch in her throat. Page after page about Dominic Cole, billionaire real estate developer, one of the wealthiest men in West Africa, owner of luxury properties, from Lagos to London. Could this be him? Could her mother have known this man? Amina clicked through the articles and images, her heart pounding harder with each new piece of information she absorbed. There were photos of Dominic Cole at business conferences, cutting ribbons at building openings, shaking hands with presidents and celebrities, always dressed in immaculate suits that probably cost more than Amina had seen in her entire life. He was handsome in a stern way, with dark eyes and a strong jawline, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, and there was something in his face that seemed familiar, though Amina couldn't quite place why. She searched deeper, looking for anything about his personal history, and finally found an old article from 25 years ago, a small piece in a society column about a young businessman named Dominic Cole making waves in Lagos real estate. The article was brief, but it mentioned that he came from a wealthy family in the city, that he'd disappointed his parents by having a relationship with a village girl, that he'd eventually broken it off to pursue his business ambitions. The article didn't name the girl, but the timeline matched perfectly. 25 years ago, right when Amina's mother would have been pregnant with her. And then, Amina found the photograph that confirmed everything. It was a faded image from some village festival, tucked away in a historical archive, showing a young Dominic Cole standing beside a beautiful young woman in traditional dress. The woman was her mother. There was no mistaking those eyes, that smile, that face Amina saw every time she looked in a mirror. Amina printed the photograph with shaking hands, using the last of her money to pay for the printout, and walked back to the village in a daze, her mind spinning with this new reality. Dominic Cole was her father, a billionaire who lived in a world so far removed from her own that they might as well have existed on different planets. He had been with her mother, had probably known Folasad was pregnant, and had left anyway, chosen his family's approval and his business ambitions over his unborn child. The knowledge filled Amina with a confusing mixture of emotions, anger at his abandonment, hope that he might help her now, fear that he might not care, determination to make him acknowledge her existence, even if he'd spent her entire life pretending she didn't exist. When she arrived back at the house, still clutching the photograph, Beatrice was waiting, and the look on her stepmother's face told Amina that she knew something was different, that Amina had found something that threatened Beatrice's control. The confrontation was swift and brutal, Beatrice demanding to know where Amina had been, what she was hiding, what she was planning. When Amina refused to answer, when she tried to walk past Beatrice to her room, Beatrice grabbed her arm with a grip that would leave bruises and slapped her across the face, hard enough to make her ears ring. The slap seemed to break something open between them, shattering whatever pretense of family had remained. Amina stared at Beatrice with eyes that no longer held fear or submission, only cold, clear understanding of exactly who this woman was and what she was capable of. She told Beatrice in a voice that didn't shake that she was done being treated like a servant, done being stolen from, done accepting the injustice that had defined her life since her mother died. Beatrice laughed, that same cruel, brittle sound that had haunted Amina's nightmares, and told her that she was nothing, that she had nothing, that no one would believe her, no matter what accusations she made or what evidence she claimed to have. But Amina just smiled, a small, secret smile that clearly unsettled Beatrice because it suggested knowledge, suggested power, suggested that the balance between them had shifted in ways Beatrice couldn't control. That night, Amina barely slept, her mind racing through possibilities and plans, through scenarios and strategies. She knew she needed help, real help, from someone who couldn't be bribed or threatened or manipulated by Beatrice. So the next morning, she went to see a lawyer in the district capital, a man named Mr. Okonkwo, who had a small practice above a pharmacy and a reputation for taking on difficult cases. Mr. Okonkwo listened to Amina's story with what seemed like genuine interest and concern, making notes on a yellow legal pad, nodding at the right moments, asking questions that suggested he understood the complexity of her situation. She showed him everything: the forged land deed, examples of her mother's real signature, the timeline of how Beatrice had systematically taken control of the property, the locket with its hidden clue about her father. She told him about Dominic Cole, about the photograph she'd found, about her suspicion that this billionaire might be her father, and might be willing to help her if she could just reach him, just make him listen to her story. Mr. Okonkwo seemed impressed by her thoroughness, by the evidence she'd gathered despite her age and limited resources. He told her that she had a strong case, that forgery was a serious crime, that if they could prove Beatrice had falsified the documents, Amina would get everything back: the house, the land, her mother's legacy. He said he would take her case, that he would start building the legal arguments they needed, that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. Amina left his office feeling something she hadn't felt in years: hope, real and tangible, a light at the end of a very long tunnel. But that hope lasted exactly one day before it was crushed completely. The next evening, Amina was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard Beatrice on the phone in the next room, her voice low, but not quite low enough to be completely private. At first, Amina wasn't paying attention, focused on cutting vegetables and trying to stay out of Beatrice's way. But then she heard a name that made her freeze: Mr. Okonkwo. She moved closer to the doorway, her heart starting to pound, and listened as Beatrice thanked someone for the warning, saying she appreciated the information about what that foolish girl was planning, saying she would handle it appropriately. When Beatrice hung up, Amina stepped into the room, no longer caring about pretending she hadn't been eavesdropping, and asked directly if Mr. Okonkwo had called her. Beatrice turned with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, confirming what Amina had already suspected: that the lawyer she'd trusted, the man who had promised to help her, had immediately contacted Beatrice to warn her about Amina's legal plans. When Amina asked why he would betray her like that, Beatrice's smile widened as she delivered the crushing truth. Mr. Okonkwo was her cousin, had been working with her for years, had helped her with all the document forgeries and legal manipulations that had made her schemes possible. Amina felt the floor drop out from under her, felt the last of her hope crumble to dust. Beatrice seemed to take genuine pleasure in explaining how thoroughly Amina was trapped, how every avenue of escape had been closed off before Amina even knew to look for it. She told Amina that she owned this village, not literally, of course, but in every way that mattered, through debts and favors and fear and money. The chief answered to her because she funded his programs and his lifestyle. The police wouldn't act against her because she had friends in the department and knew exactly whose palms to grease. The lawyers, like Mr. Okonkwo, were either related to her or dependent on her business to survive. Even the pastor, that supposedly moral man of God, received donations from Beatrice that kept his church running and his salary paid. There was no one in this village or the surrounding district who would help Amina, no one who would risk Beatrice's displeasure for the sake of one orphaned girl with no money and no power. Beatrice advised Amina to accept her situation, to be grateful for the food and shelter she received, to stop dreaming of justice or inheritance or any kind of better life. This was her life now, Beatrice said, and the sooner Amina made peace with that reality, the easier things would be for everyone. But Amina wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Not ever. That night, alone in her small room, Amina examined the locket again, with new desperation, as if it might reveal some secret she'd missed, some additional clue her mother had left for her. She shook it gently and heard a faint rattle that she'd noticed before, but never fully investigated, a sound that suggested something more than just the hidden compartment she'd already found. She worked at the locket with careful fingers, prying and pressing until she found a second, even more cunningly hidden space in the lining of the gold. Inside was a tiny key, no longer than her thumbnail, with an engraving so small she had to squint to read it. First Bank of Lagos, Box 217. A safety deposit box, hidden away in the city, containing God only knew what. Her mother had left her one final gift, one last piece of the puzzle that Beatrice didn't know about and couldn't destroy. Amina clutched the key so tightly it left an impression in her palm, and she knew what she had to do, knew she had to get to Lagos, had to access that box before Beatrice discovered its existence. She waited until the house was asleep, then gathered the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind. Some clothes, her mother's photograph, the locket and its precious key, and slipped out into the night like a ghost leaving a haunted house. The journey to Lagos took 18 hours by bus, 18 hours of rattling along rough roads, through villages and towns, past landscapes that gradually shifted from rural to urban, from red dirt to concrete. Amina had no money for the ticket, had to beg the bus driver to let her work as an assistant for the journey, helping load and unload luggage at every stop in exchange for passage. She arrived in Lagos exhausted and overwhelmed, stepping off the bus into a city that was louder, bigger, more chaotic than anything she'd ever experienced. The scale of it was terrifying. Buildings that reached toward the sky, traffic that moved like a living thing, people everywhere moving with purpose and speed, none of them paying any attention to a village girl with a worn bag and desperation in her eyes. She asked for directions to the First Bank of Lagos, was pointed toward the business district, and walked for what felt like miles through streets that made her feel impossibly small. When she finally found the bank, a gleaming tower of glass and steel, she almost turned around, almost convinced herself that a girl like her had no business in a place like this. But she thought of her mother, thought of everything Beatrice had taken, and forced herself through the revolving doors. Inside, the bank was all marble floors and air conditioning and the quiet murmur of serious money being handled by serious people. Amina approached the counter on legs that wanted to shake, trying to project confidence she didn't feel, and told the clerk that she needed to access a safety deposit box. The clerk looked her up and down, with barely disguised skepticism, taking in her dusty clothes and country accent, clearly doubting that this girl could possibly have business in a place like this. But when Amina placed the key on the counter, small and unremarkable, but unmistakably real, the clerk's expression changed instantly. She made a phone call, spoke in low tones to someone, then gestured for Amina to follow her. They went down a corridor, through security doors, into the vault, where hundreds of metal boxes lined the walls like sleeping secrets. The clerk found box 217, used the key along with a master key, and then left Amina alone with whatever her mother had hidden there all those years ago. Amina's hands trembled as she opened the box, not knowing what to expect, hoping for something that could save her. What she found was better than she'd dared to dream. Documents, photographs, letters tied with ribbon, and most importantly, a will. Her mother's will, properly notarized and witnessed, declaring that all property and assets belonged to Amina and no one else. Amina stood in that vault, reading her mother's will, and felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and grief and gratitude, all mixed together. Folisade had known somehow that she might not live long enough to see Amina grow up, had taken steps to protect her daughter, even from beyond the grave. The will was thorough and legally sound, naming 3 witnesses, including a pastor from Lagos and a lawyer who had since retired, but whose signature was notarized and dated. There were also letters written in her mother's hand, explaining the situation, how Folisade had been in a relationship with Dominic Cole, how his family had forced them apart when they discovered she was pregnant, how Dominic had tried to come back later, but Folisade had already moved to the village to escape the shame and pressure. The letters revealed that Dominic had never known about Amina, that Folisade had kept the pregnancy secret to protect him from his family's wrath, that she'd intended to tell him once Amina was older, but had run out of time. There were photographs too, images of Folisade and Dominic together, young and happy and in love, before the world had torn them apart. Amina clutched these papers to her chest, feeling like she finally had the truth, finally had proof, finally had the weapons she needed to fight back against Beatrice and reclaim her life. But then she heard footsteps behind her, echoing in the vault, and her blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, already knowing what she would see. And there stood Beatrice with Mr. Okonkwo beside her, both of them wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. They had followed her, had probably been tracking her since she left the village, had known exactly where she was going, because Beatrice always knew everything, always stayed 3 steps ahead. Amina backed against the wall of deposit boxes, clutching the documents, knowing that if Beatrice got her hands on them, everything would be lost. Beatrice moved forward with predatory patience, holding out her hand, demanding that Amina give her the papers immediately. When Amina refused, Beatrice lunged, and they struggled in that sterile vault. Beatrice stronger and more desperate, Amina fighting with everything she had, but knowing she was losing. Beatrice finally wrenched the documents from Amina's grip, and before Amina could react, before the bank security could intervene, Beatrice pulled a lighter from her purse. She'd come prepared, had planned for exactly this scenario, and set the papers on fire. The will, the letters, the photographs, all of it curling into black ash, while Amina screamed and security alarms began to blare. Within seconds, her mother's carefully preserved legacy was nothing but char on the vault floor. Amina collapsed to her knees surrounded by ashes, feeling like her entire world had just burned up, along with those documents, like Beatrice had won completely and finally. Security guards rushed in, demanding to know what had happened, but Beatrice had already prepared her story. A troubled ward having a mental breakdown, destroying family documents in a fit of delusion, needing to be restrained for her own safety. Mr. Okonkwo backed her up with professional gravity, suggesting that Amina had been making false accusations and needed psychiatric evaluation. No one asked Amina for her version. No one seemed to care that Beatrice had just destroyed evidence in plain sight, because Beatrice knew how to manipulate systems and people with equal skill. Amina was escorted out of the bank by security, while Beatrice and Mr. Okonkwo walked out the front entrance as if nothing had happened. On the street outside, Amina stood in the brutal Lagos sun, with no money, no documents, no plan, and no hope left. She had gambled everything on accessing that safety deposit box, and Beatrice had outmaneuvered her again, had destroyed the one thing that could have saved her. For the first time since her mother's death, Amina seriously considered giving up, considered accepting that some injustices were too big to fight, that some people were too powerful to defeat. She sat on the curb outside the bank for hours, watching the city move around her, watching wealthy people in expensive cars drive past without seeing her, watching the sun begin to set, and knowing she had nowhere to go, and no way to get back to the village, even if she wanted to return to that trap. Amina thought about her mother, about all the sacrifices Folasad had made, all the love she'd given, all the hope she'd tried to instill in her daughter, even as she was dying. Would her mother want her to give up now? Would Folasad have surrendered in the face of this kind of betrayal? The answer, Amina knew, was no. Her mother had been the strongest person she'd ever known, had survived rejection and poverty and single parenthood with grace and determination. If Amina gave up now, she would be dishonoring everything Folasad had fought for, everything she'd tried to preserve for her daughter's future. So Amina stood up, wiped her face, and decided that if she was going to go down, she would go down fighting, would exhaust every possible option before she accepted defeat. And that's when the black car pulled up, sleek and expensive, its window rolling down, to reveal a face she recognized from her internet research and from the faded photographs her mother had hidden away. Dominic Cole sat in the back seat, looking at her with eyes that held confusion and something else, recognition maybe, or the ghost of a memory he couldn't quite place. He told her to get in the car, his voice deep and commanding, but not unkind, and Amina hesitated because getting into a stranger's car went against every warning her mother had ever given her, even if that stranger might be her father. But what choice did she have? She was stranded in a city she didn't know, with no resources and no allies, and this man, whoever he truly was, represented the only thread of connection to her mother's past that still existed. So she gathered her small bag and climbed into the car, into leather seats that probably cost more than everything she'd ever owned combined, into air conditioning that felt like heaven after hours in the brutal heat. Dominic studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, and finally he said that she looked like someone he used to know, someone from a long time ago. Amina's throat felt tight, but she managed to tell him her name, managed to say that her mother's name had been Folasad, and she watched something break open in his expression, shock and grief, and a kind of dawning horror as he began to piece together what her presence might mean. He asked how old she was, and when she told him 17, she saw him doing the math, counting back the years, arriving at the same conclusion that Amina had already reached. He was her father, and he hadn't known she existed until this very moment. The drive to Dominic's estate took them out of the chaotic heart of Lagos to quieter neighborhoods where walls got higher and houses got larger, where security guards stood at every gate and wealth announced itself in manicured gardens and imported cars. When they arrived at his property, Amina couldn't help but stare at the sheer scale of it. The sprawling modern house with its glass walls and infinity pool. The gardens that seemed to go on forever. The separate guest houses and staff quarters that were bigger than any home she'd ever lived in. This was her father's world, a universe so far removed from her village life that it felt like stepping into a different reality entirely. Inside, Dominic offered her food, and she ate mechanically, her body going through motions while her mind tried to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. He asked her to tell him everything, and so she did. She told him about her mother's death, about Beatrice's arrival and the systematic theft that followed, about the forged documents and the village conspiracy of silence, about the lawyer who betrayed her, and the will that had just been burned to ashes. She told him about finding the photograph of him with her mother, about discovering the locket's secrets, about the desperate journey to Lagos that had ended in disaster. When she finished, Dominic sat in silence for a long moment, his jaw tight, with an anger that seemed to fill the room like a physical presence. Dominic told her his side of the story, speaking slowly as if the words hurt coming out, as if he was confessing sins that had haunted him for decades. 25 years ago, he'd been young and ambitious, building his real estate business, but still under his family's thumb, still dependent on their money and approval to survive in the cutthroat world of Lagos business. He'd met Folasad at a village festival he'd attended with business associates, and she'd been like no one he'd ever known. Genuine and talented and beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with money or status. They'd fallen in love quickly, secretly, knowing his family would never approve of a village seamstress with no connections or wealth. For 6 months, they'd met whenever he could get away, building a relationship in stolen moments and hidden places. And Dominic had honestly believed they could make it work, that his family would eventually accept her if he just gave them time. But then his family found out, and they'd been ruthless in their response, threatening to cut him off completely, to destroy the business he'd worked so hard to build, to make sure he never worked in Lagos again if he didn't end the relationship immediately. He'd been weak, Dominic admitted with obvious shame, had chosen his ambitions over love, had left Folasad with promises to come back that he'd never been able to keep, because by the time he tried to find her again, she'd vanished completely, leaving no trace of where she'd gone. He'd searched for her on and off, for years, Dominic said, hiring investigators and following leads that always went cold, never knowing why she'd disappeared so thoroughly, or what had happened to her after he'd abandoned her. The guilt had eaten at him, had shadowed every success and every achievement, because he'd built an empire, but lost the one person who'd ever loved him for who he was, rather than what he had. And now, sitting across from a 17-year-old girl who had his eyes and her mother's smile, he understood the full weight of what his cowardice had cost. Not just a lost love, but a daughter, a child who'd grown up in poverty while he lived in luxury, who'd been victimized and betrayed while he remained ignorant and comfortable. He asked Amina if she would agree to a DNA test, not because he doubted her story, but because he needed legal proof, needed documentation that would stand up in court when they went after Beatrice and everyone who'd helped her. Amina agreed, numb to the strangeness of the situation, and within 3 days, they had the results. 99.9% probability of paternity. She was his daughter, officially and irrefutably, and that changed everything. Dominic looked at her with tears in his eyes and told her that he couldn't change the past, couldn't undo 17 years of absence and neglect, but he could damn well change what happened next. Dominic became a different person in the days that followed. Not the grieving man processing his guilt, but the ruthless businessman who'd built an empire through strategic thinking and decisive action. He made a phone call to a private investigator named Mr. Langston, one of the best in West Africa, and tasked him with digging into every aspect of Beatrice's life, every document she'd ever signed, every person she'd ever worked with. Within 2 weeks, Mr. Langston had compiled a dossier that revealed the full scope of Beatrice's criminal operation. Her real name wasn't even Beatrice Nkomo. She'd used 4 different identities across 5 regions, targeting vulnerable families the same way she'd targeted Amina. She'd posed as a distant relative to a widow in Enugu and stolen farmland worth millions of naira. She'd convinced an elderly woman in Kaduna that she was a long-lost niece and taken her house. She'd befriended a young man whose parents had died in a car accident and systematically stripped him of his inheritance while he was away at university. Amina wasn't her first victim, she was her fourth, and the pattern was always the same. Identify a vulnerable target, establish false kinship, forge documents, recruit local accomplices like Mr. Okonkwo to provide legal cover, and steal everything else while the community looked the other way. The investigation also revealed that the village chief had been taking regular payments from Beatrice for years, that his sudden prosperity and the new community projects he bragged about had all been funded by stolen money from Beatrice's various schemes. Armed with this evidence, Dominic orchestrated a plan that was both elegant and brutal in its precision, designed to bring down not just Beatrice, but the entire network that had enabled her crime. He arranged a meeting at his estate, carefully wording the invitation to make it sound like a business opportunity related to Folasad's estate, knowing that Beatrice's greed would overcome any suspicion. He invited not just Beatrice, but also Kioma and Ngozi, Mr. Okonkwo, the village chief, and most importantly, a court magistrate named Justice Adeyemi, who had a reputation for being completely incorruptible. When Beatrice arrived, dressed in her finest clothes and wearing the confident smile of someone who thought she'd already won, she had no idea she was walking into a trap. The meeting was held in Dominic's formal dining room, everyone seated around a long, polished table, and Dominic began by calmly thanking them for coming to discuss the estate of Folasade Adebayo. Beatrice played her part perfectly, smiling and nodding, claiming to be Folasade's devoted relative who had taken care of her orphaned niece out of pure familial love. But then Dominic slid the DNA test results across the table, and the room's atmosphere shifted instantly. He announced, in a voice that cut through Beatrice's comfortable assumptions like a knife through silk, that Amina was his biological daughter, that he was one of the wealthiest men in Nigeria, and that he took a very dim view of people who stole from his child. Beatrice tried to recover, tried to maintain her composure, but Dominic gave her no chance to regroup or spin a new story. He laid out the evidence methodically, piece by damning piece, presenting the handwriting analysis that proved the forgery, the investigator's report detailing Beatrice's 4 previous identities and 4 previous victims, the phone records showing coordination between Beatrice and Mr. Okonkwo, the bank statements revealing the chief's bribes. Mr. Langston presented testimony from Beatrice's other victims, people who had been too frightened or too beaten down to come forward before, but who now saw a chance for justice. And then Kioma broke, the weight of years of complicity finally crushing her conscience, and she stood up crying and confessed everything. How Beatrice had forced her to sabotage Amina, to spy on her, to help isolate her from the community, threatening to abandon Ngozi if Kioma didn't cooperate. Ngozi confirmed her sister's testimony through her own tears, and suddenly Beatrice's perfect facade crumbled completely. She tried to run, actually lunged for the door like a trapped animal, but security guards were already there, and police officers stepped in to take her into custody. She screamed that it was all lies, that she had rights, that she had lawyers who would destroy them all, but Dominic simply told her that he'd already contacted every reputable law firm in Lagos and made it clear that anyone who represented her would never do business with his company again. She was led away in handcuffs, her screams fading down the hallway, while Mr. Okonkwo followed silently, his head bowed in defeat, and the village chief walked out under police escort, his career and reputation destroyed in a single afternoon. The trial that followed was thorough and public, covered by newspapers and television stations, becoming a cautionary tale about corruption, and justice delayed but not denied. Beatrice was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and child exploitation, while Mr. Okonkwo received 5 years as an accomplice to her crimes. the village chief, was removed from office and ordered to pay restitution to all the families who had suffered because of his willful blindness and complicity. Amina's property was restored to her completely, along with damages and years of back rent that Beatrice had collected from her mother's land. But more important than the legal victories was what came after, the rebuilding of a life that had been stolen and a future that had seemed impossible. Dominic officially recognized Amina as his daughter and heir, giving her not just his name, but his commitment to make up for 17 years of absence. Together, they established the Folasade Adebayo Foundation, a scholarship and vocational training program for orphaned girls across Nigeria, giving others the opportunities that Amina had been denied. Amina went back to school, finished her education, and eventually studied law so she could fight for people who had no one else to fight for them, people who faced the kind of injustice she'd survived. She learned to forgive Kioma and Ngozi, understanding that they'd been victims of Beatrice's manipulation too, and she even allowed Beatrice, after her release from prison, to work at the Foundation's training center, not as an act of forgiveness, but as a reminder that redemption must be earned through action, not words. Standing at her mother's grave, 5 years after that rainy night, when she'd been thrown out with nowhere to go, Amina reflected on how betrayal had not destroyed her, but refined her, had shown her depths of strength she never knew she possessed. She told her mother's stone that she'd found justice and purpose and peace, that she'd turned pain into power and loss into legacy, that she'd learned the most important lesson anyone could learn. Your worth is not determined by those who abandon you, but by how you rise after they're gone, how you refuse to let their cruelty define your story, how you transform your scars into armor and your suffering into service to others who still need saving.